complexity in the genesis and stubborn persistence of conflict can seem at one and the same time a heartless evasion, yet an absolute moral necessity. Britain's life and music were forged in the aftermath of wars, the two world wars, which have haunted societies, East and West, ever since. Born in November 1913, his maternal uncle was killed on the Somme in 1916, and one of his earliest memories was of a shell exploding opposite his house on the seafront at Lowestoft in the days around the Battle of Jutland, the only major naval engagement of the First World War. Between the wars, he developed as a pacifist, writing a school essay against war, much to the disgust of his teachers, refusing to join the school's officer training corps, distributing League of Nations pamphlets which advocated disarmament, the banning of arms sales, and the use of sanctions. Returning to the UK from a brief period in the US in 1941, via a dangerous transatlantic passage, Britain registered as a conscientious objector. I quote, "The whole of my life," he wrote to the panel that assessed his application, "the whole of my life has been devoted to acts of creation, and I cannot take place in acts of destruction." The pacifists of the 1930s, W.H. Auden's low, dishonest decade, as he called it in the poem, notably failed to halt the headlong march to war in Europe. War was, of course, arguably already raging in Asia by 1931, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which gives us really only less than a decade of some sort of peace for the combatant nations at large, since the Russian Civil War ended only in 1923. So that's the end of the Russian Civil War, 1923, Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Britain's position in the 1930s, as part of a circle of progressive intellectuals opposed to the advance of fascism, was understandably not entirely clear. It was ultimately, for Britain, only confrontation with the realities of wartime conscription that clarified his pacifist stance. Britain's music, however, whatever his personal beliefs and public positions, is best seen as a complex, layered mixture of musical imperatives, personal idiosyncrasies, dramatic demands, and political engagements. Britain did indeed write works with which he intended to propagandize. In some, the element of propaganda seems to overwhelm the questions of aesthetic value. One might suggest this to be the case with the pacifist march to words by Ronald Duncan, who later became the librettist of his opera, The Rape of Lucretia. One might also say the same about advanced democracy, to words by Randall Swinger. Both were products of the Popular Front period of the mid-1930s. The War Requiem, 1962, is a different matter. While clearly intended as an artistic statement of Britain's stance against war, the War Requiem is a thing of such complexity and ambiguity, and Britain was nothing if not the master of musical poetic ambiguity and musical drama, viz. Turn of the Screw, Lady Bard, Death in Venice, that it is better seen as an act of remembrance, a bearing of witness, rather than as primarily or uncomplicatedly an extended song of protest. Britain wrote a simple account of his intentions in composing the War Requiem to his sister Beth. I hope it'll make people think a bit. This just after the first performance in 1962, in the era of Cold War brinksmanship, just after the erection of the Berlin Wall, and just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. But later on in the 1960s, he offered to the painter Sidney Nolan a more thoughtful and mystery-weaving account of his purposes, one fully consonant with his self-identification as an artist-dreamer, all the way from Les Illuminations via the Serenade and the Nocturne to the opera he made of Midsummer Night's Dream. In his remarks to Sidney Nolan, he painted the War Requiem as an attempt to modify or to adjust the wrongs of the world or the pains of the world with some dream, with some aesthetic kind of object. In this aesthetic, rather than merely propagandistic sense, Britten's works from the 1930s on are suffused with war. In the same way that an oeuvre is so preoccupied with childhood innocence seems an apt consequence of the Freudian revolution, so a life led in the persistent shadow of violent conflict inflects and influences most of Britten's work. Take the piece he called his real Opus 1, the radical, dizzying, florid orchestral song cycle Our Hunting Fathers, in which man's relentless abuse of animals stands proxy for the political violence of the age. A few years later, Britten wrote his Sinfonia da Requiem, the circumstances of whose commission reflect the discomforts of that low, dishonest decade of which Auden spoke, not to mention the moral compromises to which a jobbing composer might be prey. Britten was commissioned to write the piece by a Japanese government-appointed committee seeking works to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the notional founding of the imperial dynasty in 1940. This was the Japanese regime which had been fighting in Manchuria since 1931 and which had been the aggressor in the Second Sino-Japanese War, on which Britain's friends Auden and Isherwood had reported in 1937. Britain accepted the commission, which was also undertaken by Richard Strauss and Jacques Ibert, among others, and he even planned to visit Tokyo in due course on the condition that there would be no jingo as a procedure. Much to the contrary, Britain set about writing a piece which was almost bound to offend the Japanese committee, headed by Fumimaro Konoye, Japanese Prime Minister 1937 to 39 and 40 to 41, and a key figure in the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the intensifyingly totalitarian tendency of Japanese politics over those years. Britain told the New York Sun in April 1940 that he was making it just as anti-war as possible. He dedicated it to his late parents, and he wrote the Sinfonia structured around the rituals of the Catholic Requiem Mass for the dead. Britten summed up the genesis of the work quite aptly a couple of years later in 1942, writing that the death of his parents, quotes, had an especially powerful effect on me and set me in self-defense, analysing my feelings in regard to suffering and death. To this personal tragedy were soon added the more general world tragedies of the Spanish and the present wars. It's nevertheless hardly surprising that the work was rejected for the centenary celebrations as being so very different from the anticipation of the committee. The Sinfonia da Requiem remains a singular and potent pre-echo of the much better known War Requiem. Despite the way that war hovers over so much of Britain's work, from Our Hunting Fathers and the Sinfonia Requiem to the late song cycle Who Are These Children, which has one particularly potent setting of a William Souter poem about the death of children as a result of aerial bombardment. Britain's own experience of war was that of a conscientious objector, far removed from the horrors of modern warfare. Just once did he choose to confront those horrors, when he insisted on accompanying the great violinist Yehudi Menuhin to play for survivors, many of them survivors of Auschwitz and other death camps, in Belsen in 1945. It was, in many ways, Britain declared, perhaps sheepishly, a terrifying experience. In the wake of that horror, he wrote his most subjectively guilt and horror-laced piece, driven perhaps by the furies of his own conscience, the Holy Sonnets of John Donne, 9 settings. On this tour in Korea, I have been and will be singing a cycle for voice and orchestra, Les Illuminations, that would seem at first sight to be a million miles from all this. In setting with superb, in both senses, originality, the words of the enfant terrible of French poetry, Arthur Rimbaud, Britain confronted with an almost ideal balance between subjectivity and objectivity, peerless technique and sensuous inventiveness, insistent rhythm and seductive melody. Both the intoxicating and repellent craziness of modern living and the discovery of his own sexuality, the homosexuality he shared with the young Rimbaud. 2 of the songs are dedicated to the lovers he was making a choice between.